Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the session, Higher Registers, Evolving Artistic Excellence. Today, we will explore practical changes surrounding orchestral programming, leadership, risk-taking, and evolving the artistic and citizenship mindset of our programmers and audience. We will leave plenty of time for questions throughout. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will get to them throughout the session. And I will let each panelist introduce themselves, starting with me. I'm your moderator today, Jennifer Arnold. I'm a Sphinx alum, violist, former member of the Oregon Symphony, and the current director of artistic planning and orchestral operations here in Richmond, Virginia for the Richmond Symphony. Joseph, would you like to go next?
Hi, I'm Joseph Young. I'm the music director of the Berkeley Symphony in California. I'm also the artistic director of ensembles at the Peabody Conservatory and the resident conductor with the NYO USA program at Carnegie Hall. So it's great to be here.
Great. Erik?
Hi, everyone. My name is Erik Rönmark. I'm the new president and CEO of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. And prior to that, I've been in different roles here, but overseeing artistic planning, and been with the DSO now for, I think this is my 17th season.
Great, thank you. And Daniel?
I'm Daniel Bartholomew-Poyser. I'm a Canadian. I'm a conductor and also a radio host with Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I'm currently working with San Francisco Symphony, Symphony Nova Scotia, and Toronto Symphony Orchestra in conducting capacity.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to start off with our first question, and this one I will give to Daniel to take off first. For orchestras that look to evolve their artistic excellence, where does the programming conversation start, and who should have a seat at the table?
So in terms of evolving artistic excellence, I take it for granted that organizations are looking at who is playing the music on stage, who's being played, who's listening, and who are the people that are making big decisions, that we're trying to diversify in different directions, not just race, all of those factors. Who's playing, who's being played, who's listening, who's deciding, and that we're treating each other well as we do all of these things. So thinking about evolving artistic excellence on those numerous fronts, and thinking about the audience, the people that we're offering our artistic excellence to, I think it's important that the people that we're offering to have a voice at the table, and that they're able to respond in real time to the things that we're doing. So we make sure that we hit the mark as we're trying to evolve our audience. Two quick examples. We did a little bit of an audience, engaged some stakeholders and said, we're going to come to your community and perform for you. We're going to do this, that, and the other. And they said, we don't want you in jeans. We want a different sort of experience. We want a casual thing. We want something nice. We thought that this was a community that wanted something more casual. Working at a concert, and we were putting together a concert for Syrian refugees. And we worked so hard, and we got a concert translated into Arabic, and it had an Arabic translator. And afterwards, the comments were, we're trying to learn English. We don't want to hear this in Arabic. So I think staying close in touch with the people that we're actually trying to reach and letting them have a voice at the table, maybe not a decisive voice, but a voice at the table, is really, really important.
Agreed. Joseph?
One of the things that we have to remember, when we always say who's at the table, when do these discussions start happening? And are we able to start planning in a long range way? Working with organizations that want to do those types of projects that Daniel mentioned, we take for granted that we may have to start reaching out to these communities, these organizations, two years in advance, 1 year in advance. When we have to start looking at when those table discussions happen, because when we are working with our heads down in what many of our organizations do, we forget that engagement takes time. We want to make sure that these relationships feel genuine. And so I think we really need to make sure we start thinking about when those table discussions happen, because I don't know if we've taken that into account. So people feel that we are being genuine with our ask or with our engagement.
Erik?
I would I would add to that and just say that I agree, and I think that something that orchestras has been traditionally bad at in thinking that we know what everyone wants. And what Daniel mentioned, and I think what Joe continued saying there, is this aspect of listening and really paying attention to what people are really looking for, and then trying to figure out how to bring that into the conversation in moving the programming forward, so that it feels like people have a say. And then you can decide who internally or externally should be at that table, and what type of input they have. But I think when you listen to people and actively listen to what they want, and they feel like they're involved in the decision making at some level, it reflects not only the community you serve, but it really drives programming much faster. And I think that's sort of something that we see in our industry in general. It takes such time to move this discussion forward, and I think that when you are all working together, it's the only way where you can actually see a more rapid change. We can all define what rapid is, but if you're doing it in isolation, and if you just insert yourself in a community or insert yourself in a particular venue, you might go back there once or twice. But if you really build this partnership with everyone, it's just a long-term planning that I think Joe touched on as well, where you can think about not just your next performance, but what is this partnership going to look like when it evolves, and the more people that are involved, the faster this is going to happen.
Can I add something? I want to make sure that we also think about the people at the table that are within the organization as well. When we think of course, marketing, of course, development, but even our librarians on, what that means to the project. I would say that even working at the Peabody Conservatory, I feel like I am a culprit of sometimes being in my own silo and in that risk factor, because there's so many conversations about how can we move something forward when you're a small person in the big picture of a conversation, that you want to figure out how to do it yourselves. And I mean, I found ways where I tried to move a project ahead and just fell on my face, because, I didn't really take the time to have conversations with people on the inside who were doing some of the what I might have thought were little jobs or side jobs, but they're actually really important to the greater whole of what a creative project needs.
I can follow up on that as well too. I think what was just mentioned about the amount of time that's needed for these conversations, how far in advance they happen, and then who's involved. I think a lot of our programming discussions sometimes are done very quickly, and maybe we don't give quite enough time to thinking through who's going to be there and how we could creatively engage at various moments. And a problem, and maybe this is something that we could talk about later as well too, but when we have these people at the table and we've given different stakeholders power, right? Are we actually giving different stakeholders, different people at the table power? Who can say no, right? Or are we just going to have people in and say, what are your thoughts? And then go ahead and do what we were going to do anyways. So when we ask who should have a seat at the table, we have to recognize that actually meaningfully inviting somebody to the table means that they might say, actually, no, we don't like that. And that then we have a commensurate responsibility to take into meaningful consideration what they've offered to us. So it can't just be token in that way.
Yeah, and I can take one example here. About 10 or so years ago, we decided to start doing neighborhood concerts And we already felt that we were in Detroit because Orchestra Hall is right in Midtown Detroit. And when, this is also how you evolve as a person and as an organization, you also then realize many years later that we are in one very small part of Detroit. And that Detroit is a large city with many different diverse neighborhoods. And when we wanted to find out what we could do in the rest of the city of Detroit, because not everyone is going to come to Orchestra Hall, we did this very intentionally and actually spent over a year listening. It's been very meaningful conversations, dozens and dozens of listening sessions, working with partners, and we selected 2 neighborhoods, one on the southwest side, one on the northeast side, and had all these sessions and asked them what they were looking for, and not just coming in with the full orchestra or chamber group and saying, here's what we're playing, but having these sessions and what would a successful partnership look like to you, and then creating a program together. And the programs look different in all these neighborhoods, and then evolving it. And now this spring, over a year and a half later, we're going to go into these 2 neighborhoods with the full orchestra, with programs that have been worked out together with stakeholders in these communities. And it's very different, but I think it's again to the point of listening and meaningfully listening, actively listening.
Yeah, it just means it leads me to think about, like, often in our industry we separate, right, community programs and these other of these programs, and we're very comfortable with the community or outside voices programming. But when we spend, we talk about the classical mainstream programs, if people want to talk about, the ones that we spend the most resources on, then the programming conversation becomes very narrow. So I'm just interested in kind of your thoughts on that. Like, what does that mean? Could we bring this kind of inclusive programming idea or community programming idea into our main stage kind of performances, which we devote more resources to often? Just wondering. Anyone want to take that? Does that feel uncomfortable? I mean, in the sense that, like, it goes against, tradition of what we do. The
larger the orchestra gets, I hear what you're saying, and what you're actually saying is how I kind of work in general with Berklee. Is I'm having all of these conversations. I want to know, the best thing about being a new music director is you just listen. You're just listening to everyone, and you're listening to the community, you're listening to all the stakeholders. You want to know more about the community and the city that you're being music director in, and they become informed decisions about what you're doing. And I know that's harder, when you're thinking 12 concerts a year, but I do 4 concerts a year, and one of the things that I wanted to make sure is that I celebrate. This goes into another question we'll have later, but a concert should celebrate what the community is, and when we look at what we do on the main stage, that should be a celebration of everything that we do in our organization. And if our organization is about celebrating the community and going out in the community, we need to make sure that on that main stage is that celebratory moment of all the efforts that we put in. So that takes in all the conversations that we have, takes in all of the education programs, the community outreach. We need to make sure, how can we take all of those and package it into, look what we want to bring to our community on the main stage. That's hard to do when you think of a large orchestra. But for me, in these first 3 years of being the music director of this orchestra, I wanted to fine-tune ways where I can say, we want to target literacy. We want to target this social aspect. We want to do it in every small, entity in our programming, chamber music, education, et cetera, and then we want to take that and blow it up in our main stage program. That's hard for a lot of people to do, but I think I already think that way within my orchestra. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes great sense.
Yeah, I think I think the point there is the difference between being flexible and being rigid, right? And what are you doing locally? So when you talk about, we talk about internal, external, there's also local, national, international. And so in some ways, even though these neighborhood concerts that we've been doing, these local initiatives are in some ways more time consuming in how you create the program, you do have more control over it and more flexibility within it because it's sort of hyper local. And when you look at what we do, in Orchestra Hall, for example, all of a sudden it's not local anymore. It's local in the sense that it's for your local audiences, but there's so many more external stakeholders involved in this. So I think that the more these concepts starts popping up elsewhere, not just nationally but internationally, this idea of this style of programming, I think it'll be easier to be more flexible on sort of the main stage type of programming. But of course, it's going to be less flexible the more external people are involved in the program making.
I wonder if it would be helpful for us as an industry and within our organizations, whether large or small, to think about whether we are ghettoizing risk inside of our organizations. Are we taking the majority of our risks in the concerts that have the least financial impact? It's a community concert. Okay, we'll do this crazy thing. We'll try this here. But then when it comes to the core, that are we able to make risks there? No, I'm not suggesting that we completely upend everything. But is there a zone of risk that can be explored? I think we're responsible to do that and to bring audiences, musicians, board members along with maybe small risks, maybe baby steps at first, so that the main stage concert can evolve. I think right now, the notion or the idea of a main stage concert as a place where we come to worship the greats, that is changing. I don't know that we'll ever not have that. What I think we might have are different greats that are coming to be appreciated, right? Hopefully. I think right now, if you think of the main stage concert itself, overture, concerto, masterwork, as an art form or as a form, that form itself is changing in terms of over the pandemic, in terms of length, in terms of overall length, in terms of length of intermission, in terms of interaction before, after, during. So the art form of the main stage concert, and we should think of it as such, is itself evolving right now. I don't think we can say right now where it's going to end up, but I think in 20 years we can retroactively look back and say, this is what they did, with that art form, with the concert. So.
So I have a question here about going into more detail. Could someone go into more detail about the listening sessions they had with community groups? Where specifically did you go? What kind of questions you asked? Who attended? Sure, Daniel.
Right. So I've had the privilege of working with large orchestras. I've had the extreme privilege of working with smaller orchestras as well, too. So some of these listening sessions that happen with smaller orchestras happen at coffee shops, happened when I'm out on the road and I'm just like around people, and then I meet somebody who's interested in the symphony or is with another arts organization, and we strike up a conversation, right? So I think there is, for some orchestras that have great means and for orchestras that have other types of means, listening can happen in a multitude of forms, not just formal and official, but also through engagement on a personal level. I think that's important. So I've had really great discussion sessions at Tim Hortons, having a coffee with somebody in an informal thing, or just, not, I don't want to say random, but being available to those discussions and having them with people and listening, I think is very valuable in addition to our intensely curated focus group formal sessions.
An additional question. COVID has blown up the traditionally quite rigid artistic planning cycles. How do you see orchestras using this shift to build back better? I can talk a little bit about that, actually, because here in Richmond, we've been working throughout the pandemic. So I feel like I live in constant replanning and rethinking and trying out things world. So I think, well, definitely the artistic planning cycles, I don't know if they'll ever go back to what they were before. I think some people in the industry would love that, to go back to the stability of what, I know what I do 6 months from now. I know what I do 30 or 90 days from now and stuff. But I feel like the orchestras that have kept playing and done a lot of things, actually all the orchestras that are playing, it's all about flexibility at this point. And so I think what we now realize is that all those structures that are in place, is really helpful. It has probably in some ways made us less creative. That's what I would say. And so building back better, I think what we're seeing here in Richmond is we're taking the things that we've done really well and probably going to grow upon it, and do more of that. And the things that we got it done. We got that concert done, or we fulfilled that, whatever, performance or something. And it wasn't exactly in our comfortable area. We'd probably not do that again. But I do think, if anything, it's changed, and I think we might talk about this later in the discussion, but it's going to change, in my opinion, what the role of an orchestra musician is. I think that is something that's been, I feel like it's been talked about for like the last, 5 years. But I think for the future orchestra musician, what is the job going to be like? Is it just orchestra music? Is it, because when I was, auditioning, everyone said I trained to be in an orchestra only, and it's just not true anymore. Well, it wasn't true then, but it's definitely not true now. Chamber music is outreach is not really the term anymore, but going out into the community, speaking, these kind of things, they might be part of the job now, and maybe even part of the audition process. Who knows? In some process. So, just the role of musician, I think, is really going to change. And in terms of artistic planning cycles, I think some people who are comfortable with longer periods of planning will go back to that, but we just have to be flexible. It's going to take I think it's going to take at least 2 years.
Yeah, I think flexibility is definitely the key here. Yeah. I think our industry has a tendency to come back into something, and so I wouldn't be surprised. It all depends on sort of major forces, however you want to decide what those players are in our field, and they will determine sort of, will we get back to something that looked like our normal artistic planning cycles. I did find during the pandemic that there was a freedom in planning that I don't think we had seen before. I used to say that, we as a field is very creative, but it's almost like a paint by numbers creative, that we have sort of these very outlined systems and plannings, and then within that we're very creative, so we can come up with these programs that fits in, but it still sort of follows the same cycle. And I think the pandemic forced us to sort of have more of a blank canvas in all of this, and maybe even a canvas that didn't really have borders, because you didn't know what tomorrow was going to look like, and working with that, and then finding within your organization new people to really discuss ideas with that you didn't have. I think as much as we are probably wanting to get away from Zoom and all these video conferences and really get back to more in-person conversations. I do think that it opened up doors to have conversations with people that are more meaningful, maybe not so much, I would say internally as well as externally. So I do think that there's a lot of positive things that came out of this from a planning and breaking down some of these sort of systems in it. It'll be interesting to see how the field as a whole either goes one direction or comes back into something that looks and feels a little bit like how it used to be.
In the last year and a half, it's been so amazing how many people reached out to me and asked, here's a blank canvas. What are your dreams? I'm like, no one's ever asked me my dreams before. So what is this big project, or what are these kind of colors that you want to bring to the stage? What are these focuses that you want to bring to the stage? And it's been so interesting in that way. I still feel I'll always be a young conductor. I still feel I'm in that realm of, assistant conductor who's done, the formula. And now you are breaking a little bit away from that formula, and you're able to program a little bit more. But during the pandemic, I had this explosion of inquiries about just giving me a blank canvas. And I'm hoping that more orchestras leave room for that. And I'm saying leaving a blank canvas for someone they don't know, not their music director, someone you're seeing more guest artists, guest instrumentalists having a blank canvas with these orchestras, conductors, other creative groups. We're starting to be a little bit more curate. I can't even say the word. The connection between different artists. So it's been great to see, and I hope we don't break away from that.
Sure. There's a question about the changing role. The changing role of an orchestra musician. Could others speak to this? And what are the skills that the modern orchestral musician should be prepared for? We definitely discussed this in our.
Yeah, I can maybe say a couple of things. I think in general, musicians, if we have the flexibility in the industry that we've been talking about, and the ability to have a blank slate, as Joseph has said, and to have creativity that's not only within boxes, but also not only in the boxes, but also the form of the boxes can also be creative, then we can be preparing to ask musicians to, how we have like bring your kids to work day? We can have musicians bring themselves to work, bring all of themselves. And over the pandemic, we've seen musicians who are alternately able to do podcasts and media and Symphony Nova Scotia crocheting and knitting and sewing and storytelling and bookmaking and children's storytelling, story writing. Bring all of these talents to the entire to their organizations. And I think we've been made much the richer for that, for seeing all the different creative possibilities that are inherent within the people that we have in front of us. So while there are specific skills that I think we can ask people to be able to do in terms of representing themselves in the community, I think what we can really ask musicians to do, and everybody, is to dig a little bit deeper in terms of what I like to call their own nerdy delights, and think about ways they can bring their full selves to the ensemble, that they can, other ways that they can inform through things that they naturally love, whether it's public speaking or whether it's woodworking or whatever. I believe that there's always an artistic angle. Like there's a concert for everything, kind of. But yeah, I think we can ask people to bring their entire selves. So what they need to do, the skills they need to do, are hone their own skills as a person and dig deep on the things that they love intimately and peculiarly, because that is what's going to enrich the ensemble, I think, ultimately.
Go ahead, Joseph.
I want to just tag on to that. An organization needs to have a mechanism to support these musicians that have different talents. You know, we don't, I feel like we're trying to, we don't want to exploit our musicians, but make them feel like they are a part of a bigger organization. And an organization is not is only as strong as, you know, its weakest link. And, you know, if someone has a strength in knitting that we can, you know, use in the organization, we need someone to locate the direction that musicians can go to be an asset to the organization. And we don't have that, you know. I think that's really important, because if we're going to celebrate the musicians who live in the community that we're supposed to be servicing, we need to find someone to help find these services for these musicians, because and I think they would feel more connected to their organization that they have so much pride in. So within the institution, there needs to be someone who's kind of searching out these avenues for our musicians.
Or even just also, besides the professional development aspect, I think welcoming ideas from, you know, musicians. Correct. So I think about the fact that here in Richmond, when I first got here in June, well, I got here in September of 2019, but in June 2020, I held a vigil for Elijah McClain. And I mean, I felt comfortable leading that vigil because of some of the education work I had done in Oregon, you know, as a musician. And so I think allowing other people to, and I came to the organization, I just was like, this is something I feel passionate about doing, you know, and it was an immediate yes, that kind of thing. So leaving the door open for these kind of things that people are really, really interested in doing, and knowing or having musicians know that they can come and suggest these things, and we can make room for their voices as well as part of the organization.
Because isn't that? Oh, sorry, Eric.
What? No,
I was going to say, isn't that such a freeing thing, as Joseph was saying, when somebody comes to you and says, "What would you love to do? Right? What would you love to do?" For me, that's like, "Oh, we can do this piece. We can do this. We can do that." It's such a freeing thing. On the other hand, we do have to make sure that, you know, if we're sending musicians into hospices, that we are taking care of them and that we are providing support, real support, like financial support and material support for the things that we're asking them to do. So they don't always feel like, you know, they're being asked to pull birds or rabbits out of hats all the time.
Right.
Not birds.
And I think that goes with, like, all of this goes professional development with the programming aspect, you know, and when you're thinking of these programs, building in these conversations and ideas into the programming.
I think it's great, you know, when the pandemic first hit, we created what we called an innovation committee that consisted of staff and musicians, that really just no bad ideas type of committee. And if they were not too expensive, they could just go ahead and go forward with it. We were all working from home at that point. And if it needed funding, we could discuss how we could support that. But I do think, besides, you know, when you look at the community as a whole, it's a great way for our funders and donors and other supporters to really get to know our musicians and the wide array of talent that exists. So it's just a matter of, do you have the organizational culture where people feel like they can come and talk to you about this, because not everything has to be a committee.
Right. Yeah.
Please.
Go ahead, Daniel.
In terms of, you know, what Eric just said about having an organizational culture where we feel we can talk about things, do we as a culture have an industry where we feel like we can talk about things? As a private pilot, many of us read a magazine called Flying. And the back of Flying magazine, there's a section called "I Learned About Flying from That." And it's all pilots saying, you know, I went to this approach, I read the map incorrectly, almost died, but here's what I did. It's all about accidents that have happened and things that went wrong. And the article's called "I Learned About Flying from That." So it'd be really interesting for us as an industry to have, you know, a closed door session, maybe all in cloaks and hoods, you know, totally incognito masks on, and say, I learned about orchestra from that. Here's where we went wrong. Here's where we screwed up. Hopefully we're having, I mean, I don't think that'll happen on a national level, obviously, right? But I hope that we are developing in the industry relationships, formal and informal and formal, where we can have those sorts of discussions and say, we did this, we just totally stepped in it on this one. And here's how and here's why. And learn from each other in that way. And that will help us take risks. Yeah.
So Erik, I'm going to ask you this next question, if you don't mind. What are some of the current challenges in the field that establish barriers to inclusive programming?
Well, I mean, I think when you look at the industry as a whole, and I think we've touched on this before, and there's so many different stakeholders or gatekeepers, positive, negative contributors, if you look at it from a positive point of view. And I think we tend to focus, particularly in these conversations, because we all work with orchestras, on sort of the internal, your own orchestra, whether you're the music director of or you work for them. But I think you talk then about just the musicians on stage and their input, the staff, everyone internally here. But I think we often forget too that it's such a tight-knit ecosystem that we really live in, and so you have conductors and soloists, you have record labels, publishers, managers, and depending on who you're having these conversations with, and you can have the conversation with the soloists themselves or the conductor themselves, and then the manager says something different, and then the publisher puts up some roadblocks, and then all of a sudden you want to do something and the record label comes in and says something different. And so I think if we want to see real change that can move a little bit faster, hopefully we have to be speaking the same language. And this is different for every person too, but when you look at the concertos that we program in America, for example, I mean, not every soloist can carry 15, 20 concertos a year. They in certain given periods, they might only have a few. And so what are those concertos going to be? And how can we collaborate to make sure that there's a diverse number of concertos that are being performed? And who makes that decision? And so it's not often, honestly, that the final decision is made internally for the organization. It should be driven and could be influenced by it. But I think there's a larger picture here, and so I'd be really curious to hear from our two creative conductors here too, what you face on that, because I've said, and I think it's still true, that in my time here, I've never said no to someone who wants to do a work by a living composer, for example. But it's not often the case, because there are other perceptions around that, and it might be your debut with the orchestra, and how is that going to be perceived, and how do you curate a program around that, and so I think there's a lot of questions within our industry here that we need to still suss out, as far as who drives this, and I don't think it's not pointing fingers at anyone. It's about making sure that we all are driving in the same direction, and have the same curiosity about exploring diverse repertoire, or new repertoire, or old repertoire that is not performed as much as it should be. But I think that can happen if it's only driven by a few, but it's going to be slower, and it's going to be more fun if it's by everyone.
I really like what you just said about the debuts of artists, because the gatekeepers there's so many ecosystem of who the gatekeeper of different parts of the industry. And I'll speak firstly as a young artist. When you think of your debut with a bigger orchestra, you talk about, in my head, it's been taught, and this is something that's probably not a positive, but I want to make sure I'm doing something that the is looked at in the right light. And when someone wants me just to do all new music, or they are pigeonholed, I'm pigeonholed into what that gatekeeper thinks I should do, I feel trapped. Instead of that gatekeeper having a conversation that may say, you know what, I hear where you are. Let's have a longer conversation. Maybe let's think about a 3-year plan. Let's see where you are here. A lot of institutions don't do that. You have to think about, as an artist, your management, the artistic administrator. There's so many other people involved. And in order for us to have those changes, you're right, those slow conversations have to happen. One of the things I also think about is the silos that we create for ourselves in our institutions. And how can we break that up a little bit? We're such in these silos between, the LA Phil and the Berkeley Symphony, and the San Francisco Symphony. They're right there. But how can we share information to learn from? We talk about gatekeepers almost sometimes as a negative connotation. And I think every orchestra needs like a concierge service. How can I help you with your project? Here's what we did. Here's what we learned. Here are the resources that we reach out for. I'll do anything that I can help my fellow orchestra. So we got to get out of our silos and really start connecting like we are here.
But I think it's happening on, what's interesting is that it's happening on the sort of the new work side more so than anything else. So when you look at commissions, we tend to reach out to each other and look at collaborations and look at partnerships and look at people who want to sort of get in on a consortium. But I think there could be more on that when it comes to repertoire as a whole. Because I understand that if you are as a conductor or as a soloist, you might have a certain period of time where you're on the road, and what are you going to take with you in your suitcase for that particular period of time? And if you are going to 3 orchestras that are part of a commission, you might bring that work. But if you have these internal communications and that certain soloists carries repertoire and they're going to be in these places, I think there can be more on that from the repertoire as a whole, and not just sort of on the focus on world premieres, because I think then we're falling into this trap that I think we have touched a little bit on here, but I'm sure we'll talk about as well of this idea around conversations beyond the works, like what's the reasoning for programming something, and what's the curatorial aspects to a program as a whole. And that has to do with research and has to do with communications and collaborations and conversations. But with the DSO, Detroit Symphony Orchestra, premiering Florence Price's Third Symphony in 1940, why didn't we not play for 80 years? Why was there just some excerpts here and there? And I think that if we can collaborate the way we do on new works and commissions in that same way and apply that type of partnership, I think we at least stand a chance to not repeat the same mistakes over again.
I want to add a comment about managers, because it just made me think about last year, before I started programming 21-22, talking with managers. I was having a lot of discussions about who plays works by Black and Brown, mostly Black and Brown composers. I was asking managers that, and I would ask them, who's on your roster, those kind of questions. And I did have some kind of uncomfortable conversations last year, but I will say now it led to I'm looking around, and some of these certain managers have a more diverse roster, not because of me, probably because of I think their intention. I think it was intentional, but I will say that more and more I get more emails about, oh, so and so is playing this work. They've added this concerto, things like that. So people are starting to share that information, especially in the management world, because I think they have changed their focus as well. And some of
No, I think that to your point, it's not about one person driving this.
right.
We all have to have these conversations. We've all had conversations with artists about different repertoire. We've all had conversations with conductors and managers and publishers, and we can get into all those conversations. And the more of these types of one-on-one conversations or group conversations that we can have, the more commonplace it'll become. And I think we all see that within the organizations that we are all a part of, is that the more you have these conversations, it just becomes part of your thinking. And I think until we all just have that as a frame of mind, it'll help it drive it. So you can, we should give each other credit, but we shouldn't take the credit, right?
Definitely not take the credit. But
no, it'll be telling
that.
Oh, sorry. I think if we look at 10 years from now,
mm-hmm.
if we look at what all the symphony orchestras in North America did on the second half of their Masterworks concerts, if we keep seeing diverse offerings ghettoized to the first half, right? And they go, okay, you're on the Masterworks, but we don't worry, we will get to whoever. Then we'll know that there really hasn't been that much of a shift, because there still is that withholding. What are we playing on the second half? So how do we get audiences to, like, will audience, if I go to a marketing department and say, I would like to do Still's second symphony in the second half, they're going to say, well, I don't know if there's not the name recognition. There's not one of the things that drives our industry is fear, obviously, fear of not meeting the budget targets, right? And the stakeholder, the gatekeepers are deservedly worried about that, right? Because we want to make sure that we have enough money, and we want to do inclusive offerings, but make sure that we also, can keep the lights on. So I think a couple antidotes to that. One is developing trust, thinking in terms of, trust between ourselves and the audience and how we can develop that. But also thinking in terms of how we can bring audiences along in small steps with risks that they are okay with risks that they can accept, and building trust in that way, so that eventually we will see an overall shift and far more diverse and inclusive offerings across the entire spectrum of our concert offerings.
Mm-hmm. So my final question to ask you is, how do we thoughtfully create programming to address the time we live in, while recognizing that some of our longtime subscribers and patrons are often attending because of certain standard repertoire? And Joseph, I'm going to start with you.
I think he started the answer.
Yeah.
We are trying to build that trust within our the community that we're serving, and this kind of wraps up all the things that we've talked about. Is that we have to start having those questions with our audiences, that it feels like we are creating a curated event, where we start listening to, what our audience wants to hear, whether there's a large group of our audience that really wants the traditional, or there's a large group that really does see that our art form is a living art form, that we do, we do magnify what our living society is going through. And we create those changes with the idea that we, as gatekeepers, because there are gatekeepers in the room, we are having those conversations that are coming down. That means that our world is ever changing. Our music on stage is ever changing, and we have to continue to have those different types of conversations. I'm thinking about, a program that, I'm doing in a few weeks, no, next week, where the program was dreamed before the pandemic, or excuse me, during the pandemic. And it's all about protest. And for me, doing it now, I'm thinking, is this still relevant? How can we make sure that this is still relevant? Is my audience still going to recognize what this is all about? We haven't had a protest in forever, but what I want them to realize that we're still living in this time. How can we still affect change within what we do with our audience? So for me, trying to make sure I create those immersive moments in our programming that lets what we're going through live through this kind of sanctuary or this communal space that we create as a concert hall. And how can we celebrate it, or how can we remember it, and how can we use it to move forward? There is a social aspect to what we do, and if we can create those moments for our audience, we can continue to make sure that our art form continues to live forward. So that's just a thoughtful way that creating programming around those aspects.
Mm-hmm. We have a few minutes left, so there's a couple questions about that I think ties in especially to what Daniel was saying about risk-taking, but how do we, sorry, I just lost it. It would be helpful to hear how panelists have dealt with the resistance that comes from either board of directors, artistic leadership to questions of diversity in programming, or any successes, or any, stories of something that didn't work out, challenges.
I don't know if there's necessarily been resistance from board. I think to Daniel's point earlier, what's the trust, right? Who's buying into this? And I think you have to first buy into any artistic decision internally first. You have to explain your reasonings for why you're programming certain works and why you're engaging artists, and then I think every organization is going to have a different type of trust with their community and a different brand recognition with it. I know I go to certain cities and I'll go and hear certain orchestras or performing arts organizations without glancing at what they're performing even beforehand. You just go there because you expect good music to be played. So I think that particularly for the orchestras and arts presenters that have a strong trust with the communities, they're the ones that really need to drive this change even faster, because I think that they can really help everyone else. So I think that there is a lot of trust, but I don't know if others have experienced any type of resistance from board. I mean, there can be resistance from individuals, whether it's internally or externally, but we're going to face that no matter what we do, right?
I think that there's been a lot of non-resistance, actually. I've been surprised by how on board people have been. I think in terms of helping us move things forward, there are maybe three things I'd suggest. One is, and you can look this up after, is Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. In education, it's this concept that you can take somebody and at a certain point and think, where are they and what is the next step they can take with help? What is the next step they can take without help? So thinking of our audiences and our boards and everybody, what's the next possible step in terms of widening and diversifying our offerings that we can take realistically with this group? What do we need to get there? So I think thinking in terms of that type of a model and a relationship model, whenever we have a relationship, even in a personal space, that we want to take into a different direction, it's a flex, it's a real decision. So approaching it in the same way. Secondly, I think familiarity is really going to be important. I think every child in North America that is near an orchestra should hear something by Still or Price and Walker before the age of 10. Maybe we could just decide that. Let's have a Still festival where we dig deep in the works, because people The people like things they know, right? So let's just do that. And I think one of the reasons people love orchestral music is because they're not only loving the music, but they also know when they go to hear Beethoven, the Beethoven story. There's a whole story behind him. There's a story behind Strauss. There's a story behind Mozart. We're familiar with those stories. Alongside the music that we're promoting, are we also telling the stories of these composers? And I think when people have an invested interest, not only in the music, but also in the story of the life of the composer, that will help us a lot. And that's where we need sensitive historians, theoreticians, and marketing people to do some of that work.
Okay. I want to close out with a challenge or a takeaway. But what I will say is that for me here in the city of Richmond, you have to be very clear about language. So it can't be, I think I haven't met any resistance, but when we mean black, if we say black, we mean black. If we say exactly who we mean, not colorful words that mean other things. So intentional language. Okay, let's start with Joseph. Do you have a challenge or a takeaway for this audience today?
For me, I would say get out. Programming can't be made in a vacuum. And I want everyone to reach out even further to create those opportunities for others to be at the table. And I would say people want to be adjacent to change, and make sure that everyone feels that they can be adjacent to that change.
Erik.
Yeah, I would say the same thing, and just say that, this is an industry that we need to make changes together. That it just comes down to that. I think that there's programming works by underrepresented composers is a good first step to diversity, to diverse programs and diverse seasons. But to Daniel's point earlier, having the conversations around them, telling the stories is really what's going to bring equity.
Daniel?
I'm always inspired by what composers, and I'm thinking specifically of Western art music composers, did with their forms and with creative harmony and changing sonata form, and now how modern composers are fusing different elements into older forms. And I just hope that we as an industry can be as creative with the form in which we present all of this rich content, modern and old, as they were, as the composers are in creating their works, in creating that content. So let's be creative with the form of orchestra and the way that we present. And let's take the same risks that the musicians who we present are taking in their individual performances. What's the next smallest risk? Not the biggest, but what is the next tiniest, smallest risk you, in whatever it is you're doing in orchestra world, could take tomorrow? On Monday, take a day off. But Monday.
And I one day. I'm at work right now.
I know. It's like, what am I even saying? It's like, that's not a thing.
I will say that to chime in to what AFA says in that wonderful video they just put up yesterday, you cannot have artistic excellence without diversity and inclusion. So I want to thank everyone for attending this panel. Thank you to our wonderful 3 guests that we have here. Let's keep the conversation going. You can always keep it going. I think the chat rooms are always open, and please watch the competition this evening. So thank you very much. Have a great SphinxConnect.
Thank you, Jennifer.